The Attica Correctional Facility, New York. Smoke over the yard. The tear gas rolled low across the prison yard like morning fog. Gray clouds hugging the concrete. Sirens screamed from every direction. Helicopters chopped through the sky overhead. And below them, hundreds of inmates stood shoulder to shoulder. Not scattered, not running, standing together. Inside the walls of one of the most secure prisons in America. Several correctional officers were no longer at their posts. They were inside the crowd. Hostages. For a moment, that felt impossible to believe. Attica Correctional Facility was no longer under state control. It was under the control of the men it was built to contain. Then a single order crackled over a loudspeaker. Cold, official, final, and everything changed. But outside those walls, the public had no idea how serious it already was. Because what was happening inside Attica that week in September 1971 would become one of the most significant and controversial prison uprisings in American history. Dozens would lose their lives. Investigations would last years. Questions would linger for decades. And for many families, the truth would never feel complete. How does a maximum security prison lose control in just 4 days? How does a place designed around discipline collapse almost overnight? To understand that, we have to go back. Before the smoke, before the helicopters, back to a quiet morning in western New York, back to Attica. A prison in the fields. Attica didn't sit near a city. It didn't sit near highways or neighborhoods. It stood alone, surrounded by farmland, cornfields, flatland stretching for miles, gray skies that often felt heavy, even in summer. From a distance, the facility didn't look like a place where people lived. It looked industrial, functional, concrete walls, guard towers, barbed wire catching the sunlight. More factory than community, more fortress than building. And that was intentional. When Attica opened in the 1930s, prisons were designed around one idea: control, total control. Thick stone walls blocked sound from escaping. If you stood outside, you wouldn't hear voices. You wouldn't hear doors. You wouldn't hear anything. Just wind moving across empty land. But inside, life was loud. Metal doors slammed constantly. Boots echoed through corridors. Keys rattled against belts. Orders were shouted. Concrete bounced every sound back twice as hard. It was a place where privacy didn't exist. And silence almost never lasted. For thousands of men sent there over the decades, Attica didn't just feel like a sentence. It felt like being erased from the world. Built for discipline, Attica was known for strictness. Even by prison standards of the time, schedules were rigid. Movement was controlled. Inmates marched in lines, spoke only when permitted, worked long hours for very small wages. Meals were short. Showers were limited. Letters home were screened carefully. Phone calls were rare. Every hour of the day was accounted for. Breakfast, work, count, lockdown, lights out, repeat, again, and again, and again. To administrators, this structure meant order. To many inmates, it felt suffocating. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, prisons across America were already under pressure. Civil rights movements were reshaping the country. Conversations about fairness, dignity, and reform were growing louder. But inside many prisons, conditions changed slowly, or not at all. At Attica, most of the inmate population came from New York City. Many were Black or Latino. Most of the correctional officers, however, came from small towns nearby. They were white, local, often with very different life experiences. The two groups rarely understood each other. And when understanding disappears, mistrust fills the gap. Tension built quietly, day after day, year after year. Like pressure inside a sealed container. The guard's view, for Correctional Officer Frank Smith. Attica was simply a job. Wake up before sunrise. Drink coffee. Drive the same empty road past fields and barns. Park in the same gravel lot. Clock in. Work the tier. Clock out. Go home. Routine. Predictable. But in the weeks before the uprising, the routine felt different. He noticed more conversations between inmates. More whispers that stopped when guards approached. More notes passed hand to hand. He heard unfamiliar words. Not arguments. Not threats. But something else. Rights. Food. Medical care. Fair treatment. Language that sounded organized. Purposeful. Not random complaints. Requests. Demands. He mentioned it to another officer one morning. Something's brewing, he said. The other guard shrugged. They always talk. Means nothing. But Frank wasn't convinced. Because prisons teach you something important. When people stop yelling and start planning quietly, that's when real change happens. And sometimes, real change scares the system more than chaos ever could. The inmate's view. Inside cell block D, a different kind of conversation was happening. Men talked late into the night. Not about escape, not about violence, about dignity, about being treated like human beings. Among them was Elliot Barkley. Historically, Barkley would become one of the voices many inmates respected during the uprising. He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He spoke calmly, clearly. He believed that change could come through unity, through negotiation, through simply being heard. He and others talked about basic needs, better food, more medical access, religious freedom, education, fair discipline, simple requests, things most people outside prison walls take for granted. But inside Attica, those small things felt enormous. Because when you have almost nothing, even small improvements feel like hope. And hope, inside a prison, can be powerful. Because hope makes people braver than fear ever could. The spark. September arrived cold and gray. The air felt tense. More searches, more restrictions, more small conflicts. Then something minor happened. A misunderstanding, a gate malfunction, two inmates in the wrong place at the wrong time. An argument, shouting, guards reacting quickly, inmates reacting faster. In most prisons, incidents like this end quietly, contained. But sometimes, all it takes is one loose thread. Doors were left open. Men moved where they normally couldn't. Alarms rang. Confusion spread. And within minutes, the yard filled. Not organized. Not planned. Just momentum. Hundreds of men outside at once. Too many to control. Too fast to stop. For the first time, the numbers favored the inmates. And when numbers shift, power shifts. Several guards were surrounded and pulled into the crowd. Not attacked. Not harmed. But held. Hostages. Leverage. Suddenly, this wasn't a disturbance. It was a full-scale takeover. Inside their own prison, the gates were blocked, barricaded, taken. Attica had fallen. The world watches. By afternoon, the outside world knew. News vans lined the roads. Helicopters circled overhead. State police set up perimeters. Reporters spoke into cameras with urgent voices. A major prison uprising. Hostages being held. Negotiations uncertain. Families watched on television in disbelief. How could a maximum security prison lose control? Inside the yard, the mood was complicated. Fear, anger, but also determination. Elliot Barkley stood above the crowd and addressed the men. They didn't want destruction. They wanted negotiation. They wrote down demands. Clear, specific, focused on living conditions and basic rights. They sent the list out. Talk to us, they said. Listen. But outside the walls, the officials were weighing options. And some of those options didn't involve talking at all. As night fell, lights flooded the yard. Bright, blinding. Troopers took positions. Rifles visible on the walls. Frank Smith watched from behind a barricade, hands tight on his radio. He heard someone say quietly, "If talks fail, we go in." And inside the yard, the inmates saw those shapes on the walls too. Weapons, helmets, shields, waiting. The helicopter lights grew brighter overhead. The loudspeaker crackled. "This is your final warning." And in that moment, everyone understood something. Whatever happened next, Attica would never be the same again. The morning the noise ended, the tear gas came first. White clouds drifting over the prison walls. Slow at first, then thick, heavy, carried by the wind like fog rolling across a lake. It spread low across the yard. Burning eyes, burning throats. Men coughed. Some stumbled. Some tried to shield their faces with their sleeves. Others froze where they stood, hands raised, unsure what was happening. Then came the sound that no one inside Attica would ever forget. Gunfire. Sharp cracks cutting through the air. Fast. Confusing. Echoing off stone and steel. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just loud. Relentless. Disorienting. And then, after only minutes, silence. A silence so sudden it didn't feel real. Smoke drifted slowly across the concrete. Caps lay scattered. Shoes overturned. Sheets of paper fluttering across the yard. The negotiation notes. The list of demands. Blown around like leaves. No shouting. No chanting. No speeches. Just boots walking carefully through the haze. By sunrise, the uprising at Attica was over. But the story of Attica, the questions, the investigations, The arguments that would last decades were only beginning. To understand how it ended like this, we have to step back. For days earlier, before the gas, before the gunfire, back to when the yard still felt calm, almost hopeful, a different kind of control. When the inmates first took control of the yard, many outside imagined chaos. Fires, fights, destruction. But historical accounts from observers and reporters tell a different story. The yard didn't look like a riot zone. It looked organized. Groups formed naturally. Some men distributed food. Others cleaned trash. Some checked on injured people. Even the captured correctional officers were not harmed. They were guarded, protected, kept close as leverage for negotiation. But they were given water, blankets, medical attention when needed. That surprised many of the hostages. Officer Frank Smith later remembered expecting anger, revenge. Instead, he remembered quiet conversations, nervous jokes, men who looked scared, not violent. It complicated everything he thought he knew about the people he guarded every day. Because the situation didn't look like criminals taking over. It looked like human beings trying to be heard. And that difference mattered. The negotiation table, near the center of the yard, inmates built a makeshift table from wooden crates. It became their headquarters, their podium, their negotiation desk. Sheets of paper were laid flat, pencils passed around carefully, every word debated, every sentence chosen slowly. The list they created wasn't extreme. It wasn't a demand for escape. It wasn't revenge. It focused on daily life, better food portions, more frequent showers, reliable medical care, access to education, religious freedom, protection from abuse, basic dignity. Things most people outside prison walls rarely think about. But inside Attica, they meant everything. When the paper was passed through the gates to officials outside, the message was simple: talk to us. We're ready. Observers later said the tone was calm, measured, deliberate. It didn't sound like war. It sounded like negotiation. And for a brief moment, peace seemed possible. Outside the walls. But outside the walls, the atmosphere felt very different. State police vehicles lined the roads. Troopers stood in groups. Helicopters hovered. Reporters spoke into cameras using words like hostage crisis and riot. Political pressure built quickly. This wasn't just about one prison anymore. It was about authority, about precedent, about what message would be sent if inmates successfully forced changes. Some officials supported negotiation. Others feared it. If inmates could take control once, could it happen again somewhere else? Debates went late into the night. Phone calls, closed-door meetings, careful wording, because every decision carried risk. Talk too much, and you look weak. Use force too quickly, and you risk tragedy. Finding the balance wasn't simple, and time kept passing. Inside the yard, men waited. Outside the walls, plans were forming. But the two sides weren't moving at the same speed. Hope and waiting. Day 2 passed slowly. Observers were finally allowed inside. Lawyers, community leaders, journalists. They expected disorder. Instead, many described something else. Men sitting in circles talking. Some praying. Some sharing food. Hostages sitting nearby under watch, but unharmed. The atmosphere felt tense, but not violent. One reporter later admitted quietly, "This isn't what I expected," because television images had suggested chaos. But the yard looked more like a group of people waiting for someone to listen. Speeches were given, requests clarified, names recorded. For the first time, hope flickered. Maybe this could end without anyone getting hurt. Maybe conversation would be enough. But hope inside a prison is fragile. And fragile things break easily. Cold nights and rumors. As nights grew colder, conditions worsened. Blankets were thin. Food supplies stretched. Rain turned the ground muddy. Sleep became difficult. Rumors spread quickly. They're bringing more troopers. They're not going to agree. They're stalling. Every shadow on the wall looked suspicious. Every movement from the towers felt heavier. Trust faded. Fear grew. Even the hostages sensed it. Officer Frank Smith watched Elliot Barkley closely. The man still spoke calmly, still encouraged patience, but exhaustion showed in his face. The weight of hundreds of lives rested on his words. Frank finally asked him quietly, "Why keep pushing?" Elliot answered simply, "Because if nothing changes, we lose either way." It wasn't anger. It was resignation. The kind that comes when someone believes they have nothing left to lose. Day 4, early morning. September 13th. Fog hung low over the prison. The air felt strangely still. Even the birds were quiet. Inside the yard, few people had slept. Men stared at the walls, at the towers, at the shapes moving behind the mist. Then came the helicopter. Low, closer than before, hovering directly overhead, wind whipping dust and paper into the air. Some thought supplies were coming. Others weren't sure. Then small canisters dropped to the ground, metal clinking against concrete. A second of confusion. Then white smoke burst outward. Tear gas. Burning. Blinding. Disorienting. Visibility vanished almost instantly. Voices overlapped. Orders. Coughing. Shouting to lie down. And then gunfire echoed across the yard. Fast. Overwhelming. No one could see clearly. No one understood exactly where shots were coming from. Within minutes, state troopers entered and regained control of the yard. By the time the smoke lifted, the uprising was over. Aftermath. When the air cleared, the yard looked unfamiliar. Debris everywhere. Blankets soaked. Wooden crates overturned. Negotiation papers scattered. Emergency teams moved quickly. Medical staff. Stretchers. Radios crackling nonstop. Both inmates and hostages had been seriously injured. Some had lost their lives. In total, 43 people died during the retaking of Attica, 33 inmates, and 10 hostages. A number that would shock the nation and haunt New York for decades. The scale of loss stunned everyone. Families, officers, inmates, officials. Questions came immediately. Was this preventable? Could talks have continued? Was force the only option? Investigations and lawsuits would stretch on for years, and the answers would never satisfy everyone. The notebook. Later that evening, Officer Frank Smith helped clear debris near the wall. Broken crates, blankets, loose papers. Something caught his eye. A small notebook, wet from rain, covered in dirt. Inside were careful notes, lists, ideas, plans for education programs, food improvements, medical requests. Not destruction, reform. On the final page, one sentence stood out. "We are men. Please treat us like men." Frank closed the notebook slowly, because now the yard didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a place where something had gone terribly wrong. Attica wasn't just a prison story anymore. It had become a national conversation. About rights. About power. About how far control should go. And about what happens when people stop listening. The sirens had stopped. The smoke had cleared. But the echoes of Attica would last for generations. Cleaning the yard. By the time the sun rose over Attica the next morning, the yard looked almost normal. Almost. The smoke that had hung in the air just hours earlier had disappeared. The sharp smell of tear gas had faded. The helicopters were gone. The shouting had stopped. Even the sirens were quiet now. All that remained was a gray morning sky and a yard that looked strangely empty. Too empty. Hoses sprayed steady streams of water across the concrete. Men in work gloves pushed broken wooden crates into piles. Blankets, papers, and scraps of clothing were shoveled into trash bins. It didn't look like the aftermath of a national crisis. It looked like a cleanup crew after a football game. Efficient, routine, practical, as if what happened here could simply be washed away. But the ground told a different story. Dark stains lingered where the water couldn't quite reach. Shadows that refused to disappear. Shapes that hinted something serious had happened. Something too big to erase. Officer Frank Collins stood near the fence, hands resting on his belt. His uniform was dirty. Smoke still lingered in the fabric. He hadn't slept. None of them had. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind in fragments. The helicopter, the gas, the confusion, the noise, and then the silence. A silence that didn't feel peaceful, like something unresolved. In his jacket pocket, he felt the small notebook again, the one he had picked up from the yard. It pressed against his chest with every breath. Not large, not dramatic, just paper and ink. But it felt heavier than anything else he carried. Because it wasn't just a notebook anymore. It was memory. And memory can be inconvenient. "Keep moving," a supervisor called out. "Clear everything. No clutter. No clutter." The phrase echoed strangely, as if the last 4 days were nothing more than misplaced furniture. Frank bent down and picked up a pair of broken glasses lying near the wall. One lens cracked. Mud smeared across the frame. He turned them over in his hand. He didn't know who they belonged to. An inmate, a guard, a reporter. It didn't matter. Someone had dropped them during the chaos. Someone had been afraid. He placed them gently on a nearby bench instead of the trash. A small act of respect. Then he kept working. But the yard never stopped feeling wrong. Because places remember, even when people try not to. And Attica remembered everything. Inside the cell blocks, inside the main cell blocks, the atmosphere was completely different. The yard had been busy, functional, but the buildings were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your ears. Every door slam echoed longer than usual. Every footstep sounded heavier. Metal gates closed with slow, final clangs. One after another, rows of inmates stood in line, hands restrained, heads lowered. Not shouting, not protesting, just exhausted. Some limped slightly. Some held their ribs. Some stared forward with blank expressions that gave nothing away. They weren't angry anymore. They weren't hopeful either. They simply looked tired. Frank walked the corridor slowly, keys jangling at his side. He had walked this same hallway hundreds of times before. But today it felt unfamiliar. Like the building itself had changed overnight. Like it didn't trust anyone. Not the inmates. Not the guards. Maybe not even itself. A voice came softly from one of the cells. "Officer, what happened out there?" Frank stopped. He looked toward the bars. A young inmate stood there, eyes wide, searching for answers. Not challenging, just confused. Frank opened his mouth, then paused. Because what exactly had happened? Was it a rescue? A tactical operation? A tragedy? He didn't have the words. "All I know," he said quietly, "is it's over." But even as he said it, it didn't feel true. Because something that leaves this many questions behind is never really over. It just changes shape. The official version. By midday, the tone outside the walls began to shift. Cars with state plates rolled through the gates. Clean suits stepped out onto dusty pavement. Polished shoes, pressed shirts, clipboards tucked neatly under their arms. They didn't look like they belonged here. They looked like they belonged in conference rooms. Behind desks, far away from tear gas and fear. They walked through the yard carefully, speaking in low voices. Pointing, nodding, writing things down. Frank overheard fragments. Control reestablished. Necessary force. Situation stabilized. Words that sounded clean, professional, organized. But none of them captured what it actually felt like to stand in that yard yesterday. None of them described the confusion, or the fear, or the uncertainty. Language has a strange power. It can soften things, polish them, turn something complicated into something simple. And simple stories are easier to present to the public. Later, cameras gathered outside the gate. Microphones lifted. An official stepped forward. Tie straight. Voice steady. "Law enforcement successfully ended a dangerous uprising." The statement continued. Carefully phrased. Deliberate. Hostages in danger. Swift action. Lives saved. Frank listened quietly. Because the version being told didn't quite match what he remembered. It wasn't that it was entirely wrong. It just wasn't complete. And sometimes what's left out matters more than what's said. The notebook. That night, alone in the break room, Frank finally placed the notebook on the table. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Cold coffee sat untouched beside him. He opened it slowly. Page after page of handwriting. Neat. Organized. Requests for better medical access. Education programs. Religious rights. Food improvements. Family visitation. It read like meeting notes. Not rebellion plans. Not threats. Just requests. Basic human requests. He stopped at one sentence. "If we speak calmly, they must listen." Frank stared at it. Because that sentence carried hope. And hope doesn't usually belong in places like Attica. But someone had believed it anyway. Someone had believed that words could fix things. And somehow, words hadn't been enough. He closed the notebook carefully. Because now it felt less like paper and more like evidence. Administrative review. The next morning, small changes began appearing. Subtle at first. Boxes stacked near doors. Files missing from desks. Shelves half empty. "Administrative review," someone said. The phrase sounded harmless. Routine. But Frank noticed how quickly things were disappearing. Photographs. Reports. Records. Transferred. Filed away. Reorganized. Or maybe simply gone. After any major incident, paperwork follows. That's normal. But this felt faster. Quieter. Like the building itself was trying to tidy up its memory. And when memories disappear, stories become easier to control. Statements. Later, Frank was asked to give a statement. A small office. A tape recorder. A man in a plain suit. Calm voice. Careful questions. "Did you observe hostages in immediate danger?" Frank thought, remembered, then answered honestly. No. A pause. A pen clicked. The question repeated differently, as if searching for another answer. But Frank only had the truth he saw. Nothing more. Nothing less. And sometimes the truth isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet. But quiet truths can be uncomfortable because they don't always fit the narrative people expect. Headlines. The newspapers arrived the next morning. Bold letters across the front page. Simple explanations. Quick conclusions. But Frank noticed something. The story in print felt smaller than reality. Neater. Like rough edges had been trimmed away. Complex events reduced to a few sentences. Because headlines don't like uncertainty. They like clarity, even when clarity isn't possible. Frank folded the paper slowly, realizing something unsettling. For most people, this version would become the only version they ever knew. What remains? That afternoon, Frank returned to the yard alone. Fresh paint covered the walls. Concrete washed clean. The crate table gone. No sign of speeches. No sign of negotiation. No sign that hundreds of men once stood there asking to be heard. It looked ordinary again, almost peaceful. But Frank knew better. Because places don't forget, even if people try to. Near a drain, something caught his eye. A small scrap of paper stuck in the mud. He unfolded it gently. 3 faded words. We tried talking. He stared at them for a long time. Because those words said everything. Not anger. Not violence. Just an attempt. Talking. And somehow, that hadn't been enough. The yard was silent now. But the questions remained. And questions have a way of lasting longer than any cleanup crew. Attica wasn't just about what happened inside those walls. It was about how the story would be remembered. Or forgotten. And somewhere between memory and silence, the truth waited. Quiet. Patient. Refusing to disappear. The walk to administration. The hallway to administration felt longer than usual. Not physically longer. Not wider. Not darker. But heavier. Like the air itself had thickened overnight. Officer Frank Collins stepped through the corridor slowly, boots striking tile with a hollow echo. Clack. 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 Each step bounced off the walls and came back at him a second later. A lonely sound. The kind of sound you hear in buildings that are trying too hard to stay quiet. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a faint electrical buzz. One of them flickered. On. Off. On again. The pale glow washed the walls in a cold, hospital-like color. Everything looked too clean. Too organized. As if someone had spent the night scrubbing the place down. Erasing fingerprints. Erasing footprints. Erasing memory. Frank kept one hand pressed casually against his jacket pocket. Inside it, Elliot's notebook, warm from his body heat. Small. Plain. But impossibly heavy. It felt less like paper and more like responsibility. Because it contained something fragile. Not secrets. Not plans. Just words. Requests. Proof that the men in that yard had tried to speak first. And sometimes, quiet proof is more powerful than anything loud. At the end of the hall stood a wooden door. Half open. A small brass plaque screwed into the center. Internal review. Simple words. Official words. But something about them made his stomach tighten. He knocked once. A calm voice called out. Come in. Too calm. Frank stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind him. Soft. Polite. But final. The interview room. 3 men sat behind a long folding table. Suits pressed perfectly. Hair neat. Shoes polished. They didn't look like they belonged in a correctional facility. They looked like they belonged in a courthouse. Or a boardroom. Places where decisions are made far away from consequences. A tape recorder rested between them. The small red light already glowing. Recording. Documenting. Controlling the narrative. Officer Collins, one man said pleasantly. Have a seat. Frank sat. The chair legs scraped loudly against the floor. It sounded like a mistake. Like something breaking a rule. The questions began slowly. Measured. Professional. You did not observe inmates harming hostages. Correct? Yes. You did not see inmates with firearms? No. And you're certain the hostages appeared safe during negotiations? Frank nodded. They were being protected. A pause. The men exchanged quick glances. Silent communication. Then one leaned forward slightly. Memory can be unreliable after stressful events, he said gently. Gentle. Like a teacher correcting a student. Like this was a misunderstanding. But Frank knew what he saw. He remembered clearly. The talking. The waiting. The tense calm. It hadn't looked like chaos. It had looked like negotiation. The third man spoke, voice low. Your job is to support the facility. Not a question. A statement. A boundary. In that moment, Frank understood something important. They weren't investigating. They weren't searching for facts. They were shaping language. Polishing sentences. preparing a version of events that sounded clean, necessary, justified. They weren't asking, what happened? They were asking, what should the public believe happened? There's a difference, and that difference can change history. We suggest you review your wording, one of them said smoothly. Clarify that hostages appeared at risk, that immediate action was necessary. Suggest, such a harmless word, but it felt like a weight tied to his ankle. Frank stared at the tabletop, then answered quietly, I can only say what I saw. The tape recorder clicked off. The red light died. The room grew colder. Careers are fragile, Officer Collins, the man said. And just like that, the meeting was over. Outside the door, the sky outside matched the mood inside. Gray, low, heavy clouds hanging over the facility like a lid. Frank leaned against the wall and breathed slowly. The air smelled like wet stone. And fresh paint. They were still painting, covering marks, covering scuffs, covering anything that hinted something unusual had happened. Fresh paint has a strange symbolism. It makes things look new, untouched. But underneath, everything is still there. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, not from fear of inmates, not from the memory of the yard, but from something else. The quiet realization that truth wasn't always welcome, that sometimes the system prefers a cleaner story, a simpler story, even if it isn't complete, and that witnesses can become inconvenient. He touched the notebook again. If they knew he had it, would they ask him to adjust that too? Or would it simply vanish? Like everything else. The thought followed him the rest of the day, like a shadow. The infirmary. Later, Frank passed the infirmary. The door stood slightly open. Inside, a few inmates sat quietly on benches. Bandages, ice packs, red, irritated eyes. Medical staff moved calmly between them. Professional, routine. There were no raised voices, no arguments, just exhaustion, the kind that settles deep into a person after too much stress. One young inmate looked up as Frank passed, maybe 20 years old, too young to look this tired. Officer, he asked softly, are they going to punish us more? Frank paused. He didn't have an answer. I don't know, he said honestly. The inmate nodded slowly, like he expected that. They told us someone would listen, he whispered. Then everything changed. Frank felt something tighten in his chest, because that sentence matched the notebook almost exactly. Talk. Wait. Hope. Then suddenly, force. The speed of it still didn't make sense. Why end negotiations so quickly? Why not continue talking? Questions like that don't disappear easily. They stay, lingering, uncomfortable. Transfers. The next morning, whispers spread through the locker room. 2 officers gone. Transferred overnight. No goodbyes. No announcements. Just empty lockers. Name tags removed, like they had never existed. Temporary reassignment, someone muttered. But everyone knew what that really meant. Out of sight, out of the story, Frank stared at the empty metal shelves. And for the first time, it wasn't just about inmates. Now it was about staff too. Anyone whose memory didn't align neatly with the official version. Anyone who remembered things too clearly. Anyone who didn't simplify. Anyone like him. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Stay quiet, or disappear quietly. The house at night. Rain followed him home that night. Streetlights blurred across the windshield. Wipers squeaking back and forth in tired rhythm. He checked the rearview mirror more than usual. No reason, just instinct. Because when stories are being controlled, witnesses feel exposed. At home, the house felt smaller, quieter. He locked the door, closed the curtains, placed the notebook on the kitchen table. It looked harmless, just paper, just handwriting. But it carried weight, because it showed something simple. The inmates weren't planning violence. They were planning meetings, schedules, requests, change. And that didn't match the headlines. One line stopped him cold. If they silence us, someone must remember. Frank read it twice. Then again, someone must remember. He looked around the empty room, realizing slowly that someone might be him. The call. Near midnight, Frank opened his wallet. A small business card slid out. A reporter, one of the observers who had visited during negotiations. Call if you ever want to talk, the man had said casually. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it meant everything. Frank stared at the phone for a long time. Calling meant stepping outside the system, becoming more than a guard, becoming a witness, maybe even a whistleblower. A word that carried risk. But staying silent carried its own risk too. Because silence helps stories disappear. And Attica already felt like it was disappearing under layers of paint and paperwork. He dialed. each number loud in the quiet house. The line rang. Then a voice answered. "Hello." Frank swallowed. "My name's Frank Collins. I work at Attica. I think. I think the story people are hearing isn't complete." A pause. Then the voice said gently, "Tell me what you saw." So he did. Slowly, carefully. He described the yard, the negotiations, the calm, the confusion, the cleanup, the pressure, the missing files, the interviews, the transfers, and finally, the notebook. The reporter didn't interrupt, just listened, then said, "Can we meet tomorrow? Bring whatever you have. Bring whatever you have." Frank hung up, looked out the window. Rain still falling, streets still empty. But something had shifted. The silence had cracked. Just a little. He didn't know what would happen next. Didn't know what it might cost him. But he knew one thing for certain. If no one spoke, then the only version left would be the official one. And history deserves more than one voice. Sometimes, it needs a witness. Even a reluctant one. Even a scared one. Because without witnesses, places like Attica don't just fade. They vanish. And when truth vanishes, it tends to repeat itself. The envelope before sunrise. The envelope arrived before sunrise. No knock. No mailbox. No sound at all. Just there. Resting on the wet wooden boards of Frank Collins' front porch like it had grown there overnight. The neighborhood was still asleep. Streetlights hummed softly. Rainwater dripped from the gutters in slow, steady drops. The sky held that pale gray color that comes just before morning. Too early for traffic. Too early for noise. Too early for visitors. Frank noticed it through the front window when he stepped into the kitchen for coffee. A single shape against the dark boards. Out of place. Waiting. He didn't open the door right away. Just stood there. Watching. Because something about it felt deliberate. No return address. No stamp. No handwriting he recognized. Just his name. Frank Collins. Block letters. Careful. Measured. The kind of writing someone uses when they don't want to be identified. He checked the street. Empty. No parked vans. No strangers. No movement. Only wind pushing an old soda can along the curb. Normal. Too normal. He stepped outside slowly and picked it up. The paper was damp and cold. Inside, something stiff shifted. Not a letter. Not folded paper. Something heavier. He locked the door behind him and placed the envelope on the kitchen table. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then opened it. A photograph slid out. Black and white. Grainy. Taken from a distance. But clear enough. Frank froze. It was him. Standing outside Attica's gate the day before. Phone pressed to his ear. Calling the reporter. Someone had been watching. From far enough away that he never noticed. Under the photo sat a thin strip of paper. 3 typed words. "Be careful, Collins." Not a threat. Not directly. No shouting. No warning signs. Just quiet. Polite. Controlled. Which somehow made it worse. Because quiet messages mean planning. They mean intention. They mean someone took the time. Frank looked toward the window. Every parked car suddenly seemed suspicious. Every shadow deeper. For 1 second, fear whispered something simple. Burn the notebook. Forget everything. Go back to work. Be safe. But another memory surfaced instead. The yard. The negotiations. The calm voices. Elliot standing on that crate. If they silence us, someone must remember. Frank exhaled slowly. "No," he said to the empty kitchen. "Not burning it. Not now. Not ever." The drive to the diner. The meeting was set for noon. 2 towns away. A small roadside diner. The kind of place people pass without thinking. Chrome stools. Coffee stains older than the paint. A jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Perfect for conversations nobody wants overheard. Frank drove with both hands tight on the steering wheel. The highway stretched long and straight. Fields on both sides. Bare trees bending in the wind. He checked the rearview mirror constantly. Every car looked like it might follow. Every turn felt suspicious. But traffic behaved normally. Cars came and went. Nobody stayed behind him for long. Life went on. People heading to work. Kids on school buses. Farmers fixing fences. And somehow that felt strange. How could everything be normal when something this serious was unfolding? He realized something then. Big stories don't stop the world. They happen quietly. Between ordinary mornings. Between coffee and lunch. History doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just slides under your door in an envelope. The diner sign flickered as he pulled into the lot. He parked behind the building. Reached into his jacket. Touched the notebook. Still there. Pressed against his chest. Like armor. Like proof. He stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled softly. Coffee smell filled the air. Warm, familiar, safe. And in the back booth, the reporter waited. The journalist. Her name was Lena Morales. Short hair, notepad ready, recorder already on the table. Eyes sharp, observant. The kind of person who noticed details other people missed. She didn't waste time. Start wherever you want, she said calmly. Frank sat down, hands sweaty, heart loud in his ears. Then he began. From the beginning, the tension building inside the prison, the negotiations, the surprising calm, how inmates shared food, protected hostages, waited to be heard. He described the demands. Showers, medical care, education, basic dignity. Nothing extreme, nothing violent, just human requests. Then he described how quickly everything changed. The confusion, the sudden decision, the aftermath, the cleanup, the missing reports, the pressure to adjust statements. He slid the photograph across the table. She studied it, jaw tightening. That's intimidation, she said quietly. Then he placed the notebook down, like something fragile. She opened it carefully, turned pages slowly. Her expression shifted. Surprise, then concern, then something heavier. These aren't threats, she murmured. They're reform notes. Frank nodded. They were planning improvements, not harm. She looked up, and the official version says the opposite. She closed the notebook gently. This matters, she said. Not dramatic, not excited, just factual. This changes the public understanding completely. That's what journalism is supposed to do. Not inflame, not accuse, just clarify. Show what was missing. Let people decide. You publish this, Frank asked quietly. What happens to me? She didn't sugarcoat it. They may pressure you. They may try to discredit you. But once it's public, they can't erase it. He thought about empty lockers, fresh paint, vanishing files, truth disappearing quietly. Then he pushed the notebook toward her. Copy everything. The story breaks. 3 days later, the paper hit the stands. Early morning, still damp from the press, stacked in neat piles outside stores and gas stations. Frank bought one with shaking hands. The headline stretched across the front page. Bold, impossible to ignore. Not sensational, not dramatic, just direct. Inside Attica, new witness accounts raise questions about negotiations and response. Under it, a photograph of the notebook. Open, clear, real. The words visible. Requests, schedules, human language. Frank's name appeared smaller. Officer Frank Collins, eyewitness. Not hero, not villain, just witness. And that mattered, because witnesses aren't there to attack. They're there to remember. He expected chaos. Instead, he saw something else. People reading, quietly, at bus stops, in cafes, on sidewalks, talking, asking questions, thinking. Truth doesn't always explode. Sometimes it spreads slowly, like light, and light is harder to erase. The walls feel different. When Frank arrived at Attica that morning, the atmosphere had changed. Reporters stood outside the gates. Cameras, microphones, not shouting, just waiting, watching. The prison no longer felt hidden. It felt observed, exposed, accountable. Supervisors moved faster. Phones rang constantly. Conversations stopped when doors opened. For the first time, the administration didn't look calm. They looked unsettled. Because scrutiny changes behavior. It always has. Mike caught up to him. You did this? He asked quietly. Frank nodded. Mike glanced at the reporters, then smiled slightly. About time someone talked. Not everyone agreed. But not everyone needed to. Sometimes one voice is enough to start others. After the silence breaks, letters began arriving that week. Dozens, then hundreds. From families, from former inmates, from officers at other facilities. Some simply said thank you. Some shared their own memories. Some said, we thought nobody would ever listen. Frank read every one. Slowly, carefully, because something had shifted. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had shrunk. Because the truth wasn't his alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who read that paper. Everyone who asked questions. Everyone who refused to forget. And that's the thing about buried stories. They don't stay buried forever. Eventually someone digs. Someone remembers. Someone speaks. And once enough people know, the ground can't hold it down anymore. That night, Frank sat at his kitchen table again. Same chair, same window, but lighter somehow. The notebook wasn't just his burden now. It had been copied, recorded, preserved, protected. The story couldn't disappear quietly anymore. He turned off the light, looked out into the dark street. Still, peaceful, ordinary. And he understood something simple. Systems are powerful. Walls are tall. But truth has something stronger. Time. Because eventually, someone always asks, what really happened? And when that question is asked loudly enough, someone has to answer. This time, they had a witness. And this time, the story wasn't going back underground.